All right, Jonathan, you're on. This is Tracy and Phil, and you're calling to talk about the reliability of the New Testament.
Hi, Tracy. Hi, Phil. How are you guys doing?
Good, thank you.
All right.
Good. Well, let me just perhaps begin by noting that I'm a Christian theist, and I'm as such an evidentialist. And so my faith as a Christian rests entirely on the public evidence and nothing else. So I'm a Christian because I'm persuaded by the public evidence that Christianity is true objectively. And I get the sense from listening to this show, and I've listened to it for a few years, that a Christian is expected often to rest his faith in a single spectacular piece of evidence. But in my experience of investigating the case for Christianity, the evidence for the faith is cumulative in nature, right? So it's, and by that I mean that it rests upon a network of different lines of evidence, each of which would be insufficient if taken on their own, but which, when taken together, amounts to sufficient justification for believing Christianity to be true. Would you say that's a fair approach?
I think, yes. I mean, if ultimately it is conclusive, or what we would generally consider as conclusive, when you get to the end of it, just like building a case in a courtroom, I would say that yes, you can introduce different pieces of evidence that all come to the same, that point to the same thing. Except that I would hope that if we're talking about resting our lives on something, we could do better than a courtroom.
Right. So I'm not claiming certainty or 100% confidence. I mean, I'm claiming surety beyond reasonable doubt, and I think that's the best that we can do when it comes to evaluating and investigating evidence. Right?
Do we apply that?
Yeah. If you're saying that is kind of the best thing you've got, like the idea that you're talking on the phone to me falls under that definition, then sure.
Right. So I'm sure beyond reasonable doubt that the external world exists and that the world wasn't created 5 minutes ago.
Okay. If that's our bar, okay.
Mm-hmm. And then there's also other things which you could say are slightly lower than that, but I'm still sure beyond reasonable doubt, such as, for example, that Julius Caesar was assassinated in the Forum, or that Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon, or that Alexander the Great existed, or what have you. So there's things which are supported by such a substantial body of evidence.
Yeah, when we get into history, I get a little fuzzier, but I, at the same time, kind of defer to historians.
Mm-hmm. So to illustrate kind of the accumulative case approach to arguing for the truth of Christianity, we could consider how we might argue for the substantial reliability of the New Testament. Are you familiar with the concept of undesigned coincidences?
I would think that a coincidence by definition would be undesigned.
Right. Well, I mean, the way that I'm using that concept, the expression here, and that phraseology is not original with me. That was coined by William Paley, the famous Christian philosopher. Basically, it's when you have multiple sources which recount an event, and they interlock in a way that's unexpected if one source is borrowing from the other, or both are copying from a common source, or the story is being made up wholesale. So typically what you'll have is a source which will raise a question in the mind of the audience, which is answered in passing in an incidental and unintended fashion by another source. And so it provides evidence for the veracity of that account. Does that make sense?
I'm sorry, wait.
Not sure if I followed that too much.
Perhaps it's best explained by giving an example. May I give an example?
Sure.
So, for example, in John chapter 6, this is in the Gospel of John chapter 6,
okay.
You have the setup for the feeding of the 5,000 miracle. And in verse 5, we read about Jesus lifting up his eyes then, and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread so this people may eat?" And so it raises the question in the audience's mind, well, why does Jesus turn to Philip here on this occasion? Philip's a fairly minor character in the New Testament narratives. Why not turn to, say, Judas Iscariot, who had the money bag, or someone like that? Why Philip in particular? If we look over at John 12, which is 6 chapters removed from this narrative in John 6. In John 12, we learn in a different context that Philip is from a certain town called Bethsaida, whereas we learn in Luke's account of the feeding of the 5,000, in Luke chapter 9, that actually the event of the feeding of the 5,000 takes place in Bethsaida. And so then by putting together Luke 9 with John 6 with John 12, we have a cogent explanation for why Jesus turns to Philip in John 6:5, because Philip's a local guy, he knows what these shops are to buy bread. But Luke does not mention him conversing with Philip, it just speaks of him talking to the disciples. So that seems to corroborate the reliability of the account.
Except that we don't know the conversation ever even happened.
Right, but this is an argument for this conversation having happened.
Right, but I'm saying, though, that if you have gospels that are written, you're talking about using a gospel to back up another gospel?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess some of the gospels are reliant on other gospels.
Right, but when you have... So, for example...
we can cut this short, because, I mean...
Uh-huh.
We know that the New Testament has interpolations, right? We know that there are sections that have been added and altered, and that's not disputed, is it? I mean, are we going to dispute that, or are you good that the ending of Mark, for example, is like an addition? The adulterous woman story was put in later. It's not in all the texts.
Right.
Are we in agreement on that?
Right, the John 7:53 through 8:11 and the ending of Mark.
So we agree that the text has alterations that appear to this day. Do we also agree that historians generally take a view that Jesus was some sort of a rabbi reformist, that he was not magical?
That's correct.
Okay, so if I want to defer to the body of the body of the scholars in history on Jesus and who Jesus was and what I should think about Jesus based on what the best minds in the field have come to as a consensus to this point, then I should accept that, shouldn't I?
Well, for me, I want to know whether the scholarly consensus was reached on sound arguments and evidences. And as I look at the evidence that resulted in those consensuses, I don't find them compelling.
Do you believe that Jesus existed?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Why?
But not because of the scholarly consensus, although the scholarly consensus does affirm that, but because of the evidence, right? So we have
now I have a friend who says that the historical evidence, I've got two, in fact, that say the historical evidence for the existence of Jesus is based on poor scholarship.
And who would those be?
One is Richard Carrier and one is David Fitzgerald.
I have debated Richard Carrier, and I've had David Fitzgerald on a webinar that I run and conversed with him as well.
Then you know that they would take that same position. I guess for me, the idea is, do I accept the argument of a theist on the phone, or do I accept the consensus of historians? And for me, when it comes to history, I'm fine saying let's let the historical scholars hash this out. I don't really know why there should be an exception to somebody's pet religion to bend historical consensus and say, well, let's just say that these scholars just don't know what they're talking about in this instance.
Well, I mean...
you can go through it point by point, but so can Richard Carrier, and he can make his case for why Jesus never existed, and those historians are not right.
I've read Richard Carrier's book on the historicity of Jesus, and it's a train wreck. And
not everybody thinks so, though. Not everybody says that. That's not, when you look at the reviews, that's not the consensus of the reviews. And in fact, some people will say, hey, this wasn't really a bad book. I have a few issues with it, but it's not that bad. It may not, but I still accept that it's the minority view at this point, and that if we're going to accept it, they have the task of changing the consensus of historians. I don't just throw out an entire body of research because a lay person doesn't agree with the history. I mean, and what if you're going to use mechanisms to? It's almost like science when we were talking earlier and saying what is going to combat bad science, better science, and it's almost like saying that these historians don't understand how to use their own tools.
Well, I mean, for me, it's about the evidence, and it's not about...
Do you think they're not using evidence? Do you think the historians don't understand how to evaluate historic evidence? Is that what you're saying?
Sure.
Sure.
I'm competent to evaluate these arguments for myself and look into these evidence.
Yeah, you can evaluate it for yourself if you want, and people can evaluate the evidence for 9/11 and come to the conclusion that the official story is just a load of hogwash, and we didn't ever go to the moon, and the Earth is flat. But what I'm saying is, ultimately, I have to look at who is trained, who has access to the evidence, to the best evidence, who has the best minds in the field, who has the best capacity to evaluate it, understands these tools, developed these tools, right? And ultimately, they don't agree with what you're saying. I don't know how else to put it. You can sit and talk about it on the phone if you want. You're welcome to post it at our blog, but you're not going to change my mind by having a conversation where I understand historians basically say you're wrong.
And that's not how we settle the discussion. I mean, this is a discussion. This is a TV show about
right, but have it with a historian.
Right, that's the actual audience that
you talking to me is not what matters. What I'm saying is there's a body of research that has dealt with this question, and they have come up with an answer that is not what you're saying. And if you want to change my mind, you need to change their minds. When you can go to the historians and convince them that your theory on this is the one that should win out, and when you can change that historical consensus, then you will have won. Then I will be sitting here saying, hey, that's the consensus of historians. If you can't convince historians, then you call somebody who's less qualified to evaluate it and try to convince them. What does that say? Really, is that even an honest way to approach it? If you think you have the better argument, put it to the people you need to change in order to change people's minds. That's the honest way to do it.
What is the point of running this show if you're only going to tell callers that they have to defer to people who agree with you?
No, I'm not saying people who agree with me. I'm saying I'm deferring to expertise in this case, right? And
I can defer to expertise as well, so I can bring up my scholars who agree with me.
Right, but it's not the consensus. Anybody, it's like we were talking about the bell curve earlier, where you can get fringe on either side, and that's fine. But when you're talking about the research, it's about a consensus. What you're basically doing when you call this show is saying, I can't convince the people who know about this, so I'm going to call somebody who knows less. And I'm going to try to convince them. Right? Because that's less of a challenge to you. But if you really want people to believe what you are saying is correct, then my question to you is, why have you not been changing the minds of these historians? Why are you not writing to these journals? Why aren't you publishing in historic journals? Why aren't you telling these people that their theories are wrong and posting this for peer review, to be criticized by people who actually understand this evidence, to show that you actually have a good argument? Because you're giving it to people who can't evaluate it as well, and you think that's a good way to get it under the radar, because that is a dishonest way to do it. You know what should be done, but you're not doing it.
People are doing that. I mean, take, for example, Craig Keener's 4-volume commentaries.
Good for them. Then they're doing it the right way. Why don't you take their cue?
Well, I intend to.
Thank you.
Cool.